I'm sitting here right now, and my hands are still shaking. Not from fear. Not anymore. From remembering. Because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a story. It's what happened to me. It's the moment that broke me. It's the moment that built me. And it's the moment that changed everything. If you're enjoying this so far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe, because the ending, you're not going to see it coming. Let me take you back. 6 years ago. Downtown office building. 52nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire city. I remember standing there, looking out at the skyline, thinking I had finally made it. I was Emma. 28 years old. Senior Marketing Director at Zenith Solutions. One of the fastest promoted women in the company's history. I wasn't bragging. My boss told me that during my performance review. Well, my boss at the time. His name was Richard Ashford. Richard was 53. Silver hair, expensive suits, the kind of guy who wore a Rolex that probably cost more than my car. He had built Zenith Solutions from the ground up 20 years ago. Started in a garage. Now, $300 million valuation. He was a legend in the industry. Everyone wanted to work for him. Everyone wanted to be like him. I wanted to be him. And for 3 years, I thought we had something special. A mentor-mentee relationship. He would call me into his office, close the door, and we'd talk about strategy. About ambition. About what it took to reach the top. He made me feel seen. Understood. Like I wasn't just another employee climbing the corporate ladder. He made me feel like I was going to be the next him. That feeling. It was the most dangerous thing that ever happened to me. I remember the project. Project Nexus. It was huge. 8 months in development. $2 million budget. Our company's biggest pivot in a decade. We were shifting from B2B services into consumer technology. This was make or break territory. Richard handpicked me to lead it. Me. Not the other directors with 15 years of experience. Me. I was 27 years old. In the first 4 months, I redesigned our entire go-to-market strategy. I ran focus groups. Built 3 separate market models. Predicted that our original launch timeline was going to miss the window by 18 months. I presented data. Spreadsheets. Real numbers. I said we needed to accelerate the timeline if we wanted to capture the early adopter market before our competitors did. Richard loved it. He called me into his office. He said, "Emma, this is why I hired you. You see what others don't. You're not afraid to push back. That's exactly what we need." I felt like I was floating. Then I made a mistake. I took that feedback and I ran with it. I started building relationships with the product team. With engineering. With the board members who were involved in the project. I was sharing my insights. My data. My projections. I was doing what he asked me to do, thinking like a leader. Like someone who owned the outcome. But I wasn't supposed to go around him. That's what I didn't understand until it was too late. 3 weeks before the board presentation, Richard called an all-hands meeting. The entire company. 300 people. Conference room. The energy was good. We were excited. This was the big reveal of Project Nexus. This was the moment everything changed. I was sitting near the front. My team was behind me. I had practiced my presentation 100 times. I knew every slide. Every number. Every pivot point. I was ready. Richard started talking. He walked them through the project overview. The market opportunity. The timeline. And then he said, "And now I want to introduce the genius behind this strategy. Someone who saw what I missed. Someone who had the courage to challenge my thinking." I stood up. My heart was pounding. This was it. This was my moment. But Richard wasn't looking at me. He was looking at David Chen. David was our Chief Strategy Officer. He was Richard's right hand. He was also the guy who had been in that office with Richard, listening to my presentations, asking questions, taking notes. Richard was crediting him. All of it. The entire strategy. The timeline acceleration. The market projections. He was saying David had come to him with these insights. I couldn't breathe. I watched as David stood up. I watched as Richard put his arm around him. I watched as the room applauded. And I sat there, frozen, watching my work become his work. But here's the thing about that moment that made it worse. David looked at me. Our eyes locked across that conference room. And he didn't look guilty. He didn't look ashamed. He looked satisfied. Like he had just won something. Like he had just beaten me in a game I didn't even know we were playing. That's when I realized. This wasn't a mistake. This was calculated. Later that afternoon, I got a message. Richard wanted to see me. His office. Immediately. I walked there in a daze. I didn't know what I was walking into. Maybe he wanted to explain. Maybe he wanted to apologize. Maybe he wanted to tell me it was strategic, that David needed the visibility for his own career trajectory, and he was going to make sure I knew the truth behind closed doors. I opened the door. Richard was sitting at his desk. He didn't stand up. He didn't smile. He said, "Emma, we need to talk about your performance." I sat down. I said, "Richard, what just happened in that meeting? That was my work. Those projections, I spent 4 months building those models." He looked at me for a long moment. And then he laughed. Not a mean laugh. Just a tired laugh. Like I was naive. He said, Emma, you're talented. You know that. I know that. But there's a difference between being talented and being a team player. That presentation, it wasn't about you. It was about Zenith. It was about showing our board, our investors, our entire market that we have a cohesive vision. A unified strategy. I said, but that unified strategy came from me. He leaned back in his chair. He said, "Did it though? Or did David develop it based on your input?" See, that's the thing you don't understand yet. Leadership isn't about who gets credit. It's about what serves the company. I felt something inside me starting to crack. I said, "Richard, you told me to think like a leader. You told me to share my insights. You told me not to be afraid to push back. That's what I did." He stood up. He walked over to the window. For a minute, he just stood there, looking out at the city. Then he turned back to me. He said, "I see a lot of potential in you, Emma. But I also see something that concerns me. Ambition." The way he said it made it sound like a disease. He said, "There's ambition that drives you forward. And there's ambition that makes you reckless. The kind that makes you think you need to be the star. The kind that makes you forget who's building this company. Who took the risk. Who gets to decide the direction." I stood up. I said, "That's not fair." He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And his expression changed. It got colder. Like I had crossed a line. He said, "Nothing in business is fair, Emma. Fair is for children. Fair is for people who aren't hungry enough to make it to the top. You want to sit in this chair someday? You want to be where I am? Then you need to understand that the people who make it aren't the ones who think about fairness. They're the people who play the game." I didn't say anything. He said, "You're going to step back from Project Nexus. David's taking over completely. You'll support him in a junior capacity. This is good for you. You need to learn how to be part of a team before you lead one." I felt my face getting hot. I said, "You're removing me from my own project." He said, "I'm teaching you a lesson. And you should be grateful for it." I walked out of that office, and something inside me died that day. Not my ambition. That didn't die. It just transformed into something else. Something harder. Something darker. I worked for 2 more months in that junior capacity. I watched David present my work as his work. I watched the board approve it. I watched the media start calling him the visionary behind Project Nexus. I watched my name become smaller and smaller until it disappeared completely. I didn't sleep much during those 2 months. I would lie awake at night, replaying conversations in my head. Analyzing moments. Trying to figure out where I went wrong. Was it when I shared my data with engineering? Was it when I ran the focus groups without asking permission first? Was it when I suggested the timeline acceleration? Was it just being a woman who wanted more? On my last day at Zenith, I packed my desk into a box. Richard had called me into his office that morning and told me they were letting me go. He used the word restructuring. He said my position was being eliminated. He said it was nothing personal. It was just business. He offered me a severance package, 3 months of salary, a letter of recommendation. He said, "Emma, you're going to do great things. Just learn to be less intense. You're too ambitious for your own good right now. You need to take the foot off the gas. Let people like David lead. Your time will come." I looked at him and I realized something in that moment. He actually believed what he was saying. He actually thought he was helping me. He actually thought he was teaching me something valuable. That's when I made a promise to myself. I stood up. I looked at him straight in the eye. And I said, "You're right. My time will come. And when it does, I'm going to remember this conversation. I'm going to remember exactly what you said. And I'm going to remember what you did." He laughed. He actually laughed. He said, "Is that a threat?" I said, "That's a promise." I picked up my box. I walked out of that office. I walked past David Chen's office, and he looked up from his desk. For just a second, our eyes met again. And I saw something in his face. For just a second, I saw something that looked like concern. But it was too late for that. I walked out of Zenith Solutions that day, and I made a decision. I was going to build something. Something better. Something bigger. And I was going to do it without Richard Ashford. Without David Chen. Without any of them. I was going to build my own company. And I was going to take everything from them. The first thing I did was sit down and write. Not a resignation letter or a confession. A business plan. A real business plan. I spent 3 days in my apartment without leaving, just writing. Analyzing the market. Identifying the gap that Zenith was missing. Recognizing the shift in consumer behavior that Richard was too old to see and David was too inexperienced to understand. Project Nexus was going to fail. I knew it. Not dramatically. Not immediately. But in 18 months, when the market shifted, when the early adopters realized the product wasn't solving the right problem, when the competition captured the market they should have captured, it was going to fail. And I was going to be ready with something better. I reached out to 3 people that week. The first was Marcus. Marcus had been my mentor at Zenith before Richard was. He was the one who got me into the company in the first place. He had left 2 years earlier to start his own consulting firm. He was brilliant. He was hungry. And most importantly, he was someone who understood what it felt like to be overlooked. I met him at a coffee shop. I said, "I have an idea. I need your help." He listened to me for an hour. I walked him through everything. The market gap. The opportunity. The technology we needed to build. The timeline. The investment required. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Emma, if what you're saying is true, this is worth billions. But do you realize how hard this is going to be? Do you realize how many companies have tried this and failed? How much capital you'll need? How long before you see a return?" I said, "I don't care. I'm doing it anyway." He smiled. He said, "That's exactly what I needed to hear. I'm in." The second person I reached out to was Lisa. Lisa was my best friend from business school. She was working at a venture capital firm. She had connections. She had capital. Most importantly, she believed in me. I took her to dinner. I said, "I need you to take a risk with me." She said, "What kind of risk?" I said, "The kind that could make us rich. Or ruin us." She listened to my pitch. And when I was done, she said, "How much do you need?" I said, 200,000 to start. For legal, for initial product development, for the first 6 months of operations. She didn't blink. She said, "I can commit 100,000 personally. Let me talk to some people I know." I think I can get you another 200 by next month. The third person was harder. The third person was someone from engineering at Zenith. His name was James. James was the most talented engineer I had ever met. He was the one who understood my vision for the product. He was the one who had backed me up when I was presenting to his team. I knew if I could get James, I could build the technology. Without James, the whole thing was going to be slow, painful, maybe impossible. I called him up. I said, "Can we meet?" Not at the office. Somewhere else. We met at a bar near his apartment. I told him everything. About what happened at Zenith. About my plan. About the company I was going to build. He looked at me for a long time. Then he said, "You know what you're asking me to do, right? You're asking me to leave a 6-figure salary. You're asking me to take a risk on something that might not work. You're asking me to burn a bridge with Richard." I said, "I know." He said, "Why would I do that?" I said, "Because you know I'm right. Because you know Project Nexus is going to fail. Because you know that what I'm building is better. And because..." I paused. "Because you're tired of building other people's dreams." He didn't say anything for a minute. Then he raised his glass. He said, "When do we start?" That was the beginning of Velocity. Velocity was the name of my company. I chose it because it meant speed. It meant acceleration. It meant forward momentum that nothing could stop. We started in Marcus's office space. 300 square feet. We could barely fit 4 desks in there. The rent was $2,000 a month. We had 6 months of runway if we were careful. For the first 3 months, we didn't even have a product. We had a vision. We had code. We had late nights and too much coffee and conversations that lasted until 3 in the morning. James was building the technology. Lisa was managing our funds and preparing investor materials. Marcus was handling business strategy and sales. And I was doing everything. I was writing code with James sometimes. I was sitting in on investor pitches with Lisa. I was handling customer interviews. I was literally doing whatever needed to be done to keep the company alive. I was working 80, 90 hours a week. I was living on my savings from Zenith and a credit card. I was scared almost every moment of every day. But I was also happier than I had been in years. Because this was mine. This wasn't someone else's vision that I was supporting. This wasn't someone else's dream that I was making real. This was my dream. My company. My decision. My risk. My potential failure. That meant something different. Around month 4, we had our first real investor meeting. Lisa had set it up with a venture capital partner she knew. 10 million under management. Aggressive investor. Looking for the next big thing. We went into that meeting with nothing. No revenue. No users. No proven technology. Just a deck. A vision. And me, standing in front of this investor, completely terrified but pretending I wasn't. I remember walking in and thinking, this is it. This is where it all either works or falls apart. The investor's name was Andrew. He was probably 45. He had that energy of someone who had already made money and was hungry to make more. He looked at our deck. He looked at our numbers. He looked at our team. And then he looked at me. He said, "Tell me why I should invest in you. And please, don't give me the pitch. Tell me why you specifically. Why should I bet on you instead of the 1,000 other founders I meet who have the same idea?" I took a breath. I said, "Because I've already failed. I've already watched my work stolen. I've already lost something that mattered to me. And instead of giving up, I'm here. I'm building something bigger. I'm building something that's going to change the market. And I'm not doing it for the money. I'm doing it because the alternative is letting the people who took from me win. I'm doing it because I have something to prove. And people who have something to prove, we don't stop. We don't give up. We don't know how to lose." The room was silent. Andrew leaned back in his chair. Then he smiled. He said, "I like that. I like the hunger. I like the anger. Hunger and anger are how empires are built. He paused. He said, "I'm going to invest $1 million in your company." I felt like my heart was going to explode out of my chest. That was the first check. Over the next 6 months, we raised another $3 million through other investors that Andrew connected us with. We moved into a real office space. We hired more engineers. We built our product. And meanwhile, Project Nexus was launching at Zenith. I followed it. I read every article. I watched the media coverage. I saw Richard's face on the covers of business magazines. I saw David Chen being called the visionary behind the next generation of consumer technology. But I also saw something else. I saw the early metrics. I saw the user adoption rates. I saw the engagement numbers. They were lower than expected. I wasn't surprised. 8 months after launching, Project Nexus was the second biggest launch Zenith had ever done. It was profitable. It was successful by most measures. But it wasn't what they had promised. It wasn't revolutionary. It was just good. A solid product in a crowded market. Meanwhile, we launched Velocity. We launched on a Tuesday in September, a year and a half after I left Zenith. We had been working on this product for 18 months. James had built something that was elegant, efficient. Something that did what Project Nexus was trying to do, but better. Something that understood the consumer in a way that Project Nexus never would. The launch was quiet. We didn't have the resources for a huge PR push. We didn't have Richard's reputation or David's visibility. What we had was product that was so good, people couldn't stop using it. 2 weeks after launch, we had 10,000 users. A month after launch, we had 50,000 users. 3 months after launch, we had 2 million users. 6 months after launch, we had acquired half of the users that Project Nexus had acquired in its first year. But here's the thing. Our users weren't just using the product. They were loving it. They were talking about it. They were building communities around it. They were creating content about it. Project Nexus was a product people used. Velocity was a product people loved. I remember the day Lisa came to me and said we had received an offer. A big offer. From a major tech company. They wanted to acquire us. They were offering $200 million. I said no. She looked at me like I was insane. She said, "Emma, $200 million. Do you understand what that means? That's a 100-fold return on capital. That's success beyond what most startups ever achieve." I said, "I know what it means. And it's not enough." She said, "What do you mean it's not enough?" I said, "I mean I'm not doing this for money. I'm doing this to win. And we haven't won yet." Lisa looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, "You're not over it, are you? You're still angry at Richard." I didn't say anything. She said, "Emma, what are you doing? What is this about?" I said, "It's about them finding out. It's about Zenith realizing what they lost. It's about Richard understanding that he made a mistake firing me. It's about David seeing what I built without them. It's about all of it." Lisa sat down. She said, "And what happens when all of that happens? What happens when you've won? What happens then?" I didn't have an answer. So we turned down the offer. We kept building. A year later, Velocity was worth $1 billion. We had 6 million active users. We were the fastest growing company in our space. And Richard Ashford was starting to notice. I knew because I saw the articles. I saw Zenith announcing they were exploring strategic partnerships. I saw them bring in new executives to accelerate growth. I saw them trying to pivot their strategy. I saw them finally understanding what I had understood 18 months earlier. Then I saw the announcement. Zenith was being acquired by a larger company for $500 million. Half of what they valued themselves at 3 years earlier. Half of what they should have been valued at if Project Nexus had actually been successful. Richard Ashford was still the CEO, but he was no longer the owner. The new company was reorganizing the leadership. David Chen was being demoted to a director-level role. Richard was keeping his position, but his stock was worth less. His control was diminished. And I felt something strange when I read that news. I felt empty. Because the revenge I had fantasized about, it wasn't satisfying the way I thought it would be. Zenith failing wasn't making me feel better. Their decline wasn't making me feel like I had won. I had won. I had built velocity. I had created something that was changing the market. I had proven that I was right and they were wrong. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like I was chasing something I could never catch. That's when Lisa sat me down again. We were in our office. It was late. Everyone had gone home. Just me and her. She said, "We got another offer. Much bigger this time. $5 billion. From Horizon Tech. $5 billion. I remember feeling physically ill. Lisa said, "You said you wanted to win. We've won. This is what winning looks like." I said, That's not what this was supposed to be about." She said, "Then what was it supposed to be about?" "Emma, you built an incredible company. You proved everyone wrong. You're successful. You're rich. You have everything you wanted." I said, "I wanted to prove something to Richard." She said, "You did. You built a company worth $5 billion. He was fired from his company failed. What more do you need?" I didn't answer because I didn't have an answer. That night, I went home and I didn't sleep. I sat by my window and I looked out at the city. The same city I had looked out at from Richard's office 6 years earlier. I had thought that sitting in that chair, having that office, proving that I was successful, that was going to feel like victory. But there was an empty space inside me that no amount of success could fill. I realized that night that revenge wasn't something you win. It was something that consumed you. I realized I had spent 6 years being angry. 6 years being focused on proving something. 6 years running away from something instead of running toward it. And now I had everything, but I still felt like I had nothing. The next morning, I did something I hadn't done in 6 years. I called Marcus. I said, "I need to talk to someone. Someone who knows what happened. Someone who was there." We met at the same coffee shop where I had first pitched him the idea. I said, "I don't know how to do this anymore. I don't know how to just be successful. It doesn't feel like what I thought it would feel like." Marcus looked at me and smiled. It was sad. It was understanding. He said, "Emma, do you know why I left Zenith?" I said, "Because Richard passed you over for a promotion." He said, "That's true. But that's not the real reason. The real reason is I woke up one day and realized I had spent 10 years of my life making Richard Ashford rich. 10 years of my best ideas going into his company. 10 years of my potential being used to build his empire." He paused. He said, "And I was furious. I was angrier than I had ever been. And I wanted revenge. I wanted to prove that I was better. That I was smarter. That I was the one who should have succeeded." I said, "But you did succeed. You built a consulting firm. You're doing well." He said, "Yeah, I did. And you know what? It still didn't feel good enough. Because revenge doesn't have a finish line. There's always someone else you want to prove something to. There's always another level. Another accomplishment. Another person you want to make regret what they did to you." I was quiet. He said, "So one day I decided I was going to stop. I was going to let it go. And you know what? That's when I actually started being happy." I said, "How did you do that?" He said, "I made a choice. I chose to focus on building something I loved instead of tearing down something I hated. I chose to create instead of destroy." I went home that day and I thought about his words. I thought about what I had built. I thought about velocity. About the team I had put together. About the product we had created that was actually helping millions of people. I had done that. I had created that. That was the accomplishment. Not the fact that Zenith failed. Not the fact that Richard was diminished. That wasn't my victory. My victory was what I built. My victory was velocity. I decided to accept the offer. $5 billion. Horizon Tech wanted to acquire us. They wanted to keep our team in place. They wanted to keep me as the CEO. They wanted to integrate Velocity into their platform and turn it into something bigger. When I told Lisa, she hugged me. She actually hugged me. She said, "You did it. You finally did it." I said, "We did it. I couldn't have done this without you. Without Marcus. Without James." She said, "You did the hard part. You had the vision. You had the courage. We just helped you get there." The acquisition was announced on a Tuesday. It was in every major business publication. The headlines called it a landmark acquisition. They called me the visionary entrepreneur who built Velocity from scratch. They talked about the journey, about leaving Zenith to build something bigger. And they mentioned Richard. They mentioned Zenith. They mentioned how the company I left had declined while I had ascended. I saw the news coverage. I knew what was coming. 2 days after the acquisition was announced, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't answer it. But I did. It was Richard. He said, "Emma, congratulations on the acquisition." I could hear something in his voice. Something I had never heard from him before. Humility. He said, "I owe you an apology. A real apology, not the kind I gave you in my office when I was trying to sound wise." I didn't say anything. He said, "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what I said. I was wrong about the way I treated you. And I was wrong about Project Nexus." My heart was beating hard. He said, "I read the analysis. I read what the experts are saying about why Project Nexus didn't become what we thought it would become. And they're saying it's because we missed the market shift. Exactly what you predicted. Exactly what you were trying to tell me. And I didn't listen. Because I was threatened by you." I said, "Why are you calling me?" He said, "Because you deserve to know. You deserve to know that I understand now. You deserve to know that you were right. And I was wrong. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt like everything I had worked toward was finally paying off. But instead, I just felt tired." I said, "Richard, I appreciate that. I really do. But I have to tell you something. I don't need you to tell me I was right. I've known that for 6 years. The question isn't whether I was right or whether you were wrong. The question is what I do with that knowledge." He said, "What do you mean?" I said, "I spent 6 years being angry at you. 6 years thinking about revenge. 6 years trying to build something so successful that it would prove you were wrong and I was right. And I did it. I built Velocity. It's worth $5 billion now. And you know what? When I found out, I didn't feel happy. I felt empty." He was quiet. I said, "I realized that I wasn't building Velocity because I loved it. I was building it because I hated you. And that's not a foundation for anything. That's just poison." I said, "So I'm not calling to say I forgive you. I'm calling to say I'm letting it go. Not for you. For me. Because I can't build the next thing if I'm still stuck in the last thing." I hung up the phone. And for the first time in 6 years, I took a real breath. Not because I had one. Not because I had proven something. But because I had stopped trying to prove something. I had started building for myself instead of against someone else. The acquisition closed 3 months later. When it did, I became a billionaire. When I was 32 years old, I had more money than I had ever dreamed possible. And then I took 6 months off. I didn't work. I didn't think about business. I didn't check emails. I didn't do anything except sit with myself and figure out who I was without the anger. It took longer than I thought it would. But eventually, I figured it out. I figured out that Emma, the real Emma, wasn't someone who was defined by what had been taken from her. She wasn't defined by revenge or ambition or the need to prove something to someone else. The real Emma was someone who loved creating, who loved building, who loved solving problems, who loved leading a team toward something impossible. That was the thing that had been there all along. That was the thing I had lost sight of. When I came back to work after my 6 months off, I had a new plan. I had a new vision. And it wasn't about revenge or anger or any of that. It was about what I actually loved. I called Marcus and Lisa and James into my office. It was late afternoon. The sun was coming through the windows. I said, I want to start a new company. They looked at me like I was crazy. James said, Emma, we just sold Velocity for $5 billion. We're all rich. We don't need to start a company. I said, I know. But I want to. I want to build something else. Something different. I want to help other founders who have been treated the way I was treated. I want to build an accelerator that's focused on founders who have been doubted, who have been underestimated, who have been told they can't do it. I said, I want to take everything I learned from the worst experience of my life and turn it into something that helps other people. Lisa said, so you want to turn your pain into purpose? I said, yeah, I do. And that's what we did. We started an accelerator called Rising. Rising because we were all rising. Rising because we were lifting other people up. Rising because we were moving beyond what had held us down. In the first year, we funded 50 startups. In the second year, 200. In the third year, 4 of our portfolio companies were valued at over $1 billion. But the money wasn't the point. The point was the impact. The point was the founders who had been told they weren't good enough now building companies that were changing the world. The point was turning pain into purpose. And then something unexpected happened. I got a message from David Chen. David, who had stolen my work. David, who had been promoted on the back of my ideas. David, who I had fantasized about crushing for 6 years. The message said, Emma, I need to meet with you. There's something I need to tell you. It's important. I almost deleted it. But something made me write back. Something made me say yes. We met at a coffee shop. Neutral ground. I didn't know what he wanted, but I was curious. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. He looked older. Tired. Worn down. He sat across from me. He didn't say hello. He didn't do small talk. He said, I've been following your career. I've been reading about what you're building. And I need to tell you something that I should have told you 6 years ago. I didn't say anything. He said, what I did at Zenith, stealing your work, taking credit for your ideas, it was the worst thing I've ever done. And it haunted me. It haunted me for 6 years. Every success I had felt hollow. Every achievement felt undeserved. Because I knew. I knew that I hadn't earned it. I knew that it was built on something that wasn't mine. He was looking at me with red eyes. Like he was about to cry. He said, Richard promoted me. I rose higher. I made more money. And none of it made me happy. None of it made me feel like I was successful. Because deep down, I knew the truth. I knew what I had done. He said, and then I saw what you built. I saw Velocity growing. I saw you becoming successful on your own terms. And I realized something. I realized that what I did didn't just hurt you. It hurt me. Because I became someone I didn't want to be. I was watching him. I was listening. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was just listening. He said, I left Zenith 2 years ago. Richard tried to keep me, but I couldn't stay. Every day I was there, I felt like a fraud. Every meeting, every presentation, every success, it all felt like a lie. He said, I've been working as a consultant. Making good money. But I've been thinking about what I did. Thinking about you. Thinking about how to make it right. I said, why are you telling me this? He said, because I saw that you're starting an accelerator. Rising. And I want to be part of it. I want to invest. I want to help. I want to do something good with the success that I got through doing something bad. I looked at him for a long moment. I said, why should I trust you? Why should I work with you after what you did? He said, you shouldn't. You have every right not to. But I'm asking anyway. Because I think you're the kind of person who understands that people can change. I think you're the kind of person who knows that revenge doesn't actually feel good. I think you're the kind of person who moved beyond anger and into something better. He said, and I want to be better too. I want to be someone who built something instead of someone who stole something. I didn't respond right away. I thought about it. I thought about the Emma from 6 years ago. The Emma who would have said no immediately. The Emma who would have seen this as an opportunity to make him feel small. To make him regret what he had done. I thought about the Emma I had become. The Emma who understood that everyone deserves a second chance. That people can change. That forgiveness isn't about the person you're forgiving. It's about the person you want to be. I said, I'll think about it. He nodded. He said, that's all I'm asking. He stood up to leave. But before he did, he said, I need to tell you one more thing. Richard reached out to me after your acquisition was announced. He asked me to help him start a new company. He said he was going to rebuild everything he lost. I said, are you going to help him? He said, no. I told him no. I told him that I was done building someone else's empire. I told him I was going to build my own thing or help other people build theirs. But I wasn't going to spend another second chasing someone else's dream. When he left, I sat there for a long time. And I thought about Richard. I thought about what he was probably going through. Losing Zenith. Losing his company. Losing the thing that defined him for 20 years. I thought about the pain he was probably experiencing. And I realized that I didn't want to see him suffer anymore. I didn't want that. I had thought I did, but I didn't. I called Marcus. I said, I need to talk to Richard. Marcus said, are you sure? That's a lot of history. I said, I know. But I need to do this. I need to close this chapter. I got Richard's number through a contact. I called him that afternoon. He answered on the second ring. His voice was surprised. He said, Emma. I didn't expect to hear from you. I said, I wanted to talk to you. Not as rivals. Not as enemies. Just as two people who had something difficult happen between them. There was silence on the line. I said, I know you're starting a new company. I know you're trying to rebuild after Zenith. He said, how did you know that? I said, does it matter? Richard, I need to tell you something. I need to tell you that I'm letting this go. Whatever happened between us. Whatever hurt there was. I'm letting it go. He said, Emma, I said, let me finish. I'm not saying that to make you feel better. I'm saying it because I realized that holding on to this anger was only hurting me. It was consuming me. It was poisoning everything I was building. I said, I built Velocity not because I loved it at first. I built it because I hated you. And I was miserable. And I finally realized that I needed to let that go. He said, I don't deserve your forgiveness. I said, you're right. You don't. But I'm giving it anyway. Not for you. For me. I said, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to invest in your new company. Not because I believe in you. Not because I trust you. But because I believe in second chances. And I believe that you're capable of learning from your mistakes. There was silence. I said, but there are conditions. You're going to have to be honest. About what happened with me. About what happened with Project Nexus. You're going to have to own your mistakes publicly. And you're never, ever going to discount another person's contribution to your success. He said, Emma, I can't do that. That would destroy my reputation. I said, I know. And that's the choice. You can rebuild quietly and never really change. Or you can rebuild honestly and actually become someone different. It's up to you. I hung up. I didn't hear from him for 3 weeks. And then I got an email. It was a long email. It was an article that Richard had written for a major business publication. The title was, The Mistakes I Made as a CEO and What I Learned Too Late. In the article, he talked about his leadership style. He talked about how he had built a company that was about him instead of about his people. He talked about how he had taken credit for other people's work. He talked about me. About Project Nexus. About the mistakes he had made with the strategy. He talked about how dismissing my concerns about the timeline had been a critical error. He talked about how crediting David instead of me had damaged not just me but the entire company culture. He talked about the cost of his ego. It was the most vulnerable thing I had ever read from Richard Ashford. After I read it, I called him. I said, "Thank you." He said, "Does this mean you're still going to invest?" I said, "Yes. I am. Because this is real. This is what change looks like." We funded his new company. It was a venture consulting firm. He was using everything he had learned from his decades in the industry to help other founders avoid the mistakes he had made. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was Richard Ashford, the man who had tried to control and manipulate, now making his living by teaching other people how not to do what he had done. And it was working. His company was successful. It was profitable. It was making an impact. But here's the thing. It wasn't about Richard's success anymore. It wasn't about him being vindicated or proven right or any of that. It was just about him being better. Being different. Being someone who had learned something real. 5 years after I left Zenith, I was sitting in my office at Rising when I got a call from an old colleague. Someone I hadn't spoken to in years. She said, "Emma, I'm calling because something's happening at Zenith and I thought you should know." I said, "What?" She said, "The company is closing. Not going bankrupt. Closing. The new owners are liquidating it. They're selling off the assets. Project Nexus is being discontinued." I should have felt something. I should have felt vindicated. I should have felt like justice was being served. But I just felt sad. Sad that it had come to that. Sad that what had started as such a promising company, what Richard had built from nothing, was now being shut down. I called Richard. I said, "I heard about Zenith." He said, "Yeah. I know. I heard it this morning." I said, "How do you feel?" He said, "Honestly, I feel relieved. I spent 20 years building that company. 20 years of my life. And it became something I didn't recognize. It became something hollow. Something that was more about me than about the mission. So in a way, this is good. This is closure." He said, "Plus, my consulting company is doing well. I'm helping founders. I'm making a difference. I'm actually enjoying my work for the first time in a decade." I said, "That's good. I'm glad." He said, "Emma, can I ask you something?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Do you ever regret it? Do you ever regret leaving Zenith? Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had stayed?" I said, "No. Not anymore. I spent years angry about leaving. I spent years convinced that I had been wronged. But looking back, I realized that leaving was the best thing that could have happened to me. It forced me to become independent. It forced me to trust myself. It forced me to build something that was actually mine." I said, "So no, I don't regret it. I'm grateful for it." He said, "I envy that. I envy the fact that you were able to move beyond the anger. I envy the fact that you found something you loved." I said, "You can too. You already are." He said, "Maybe. But I'm 58 years old. I spent 30 years trying to build an empire. And now I'm 60 pages into my second act. It's different. It's smaller. But it's real." After I hung up, I sat in my office and I thought about the entire journey. I thought about where I had started. I thought about the pain. I thought about the anger. I thought about the revenge fantasy. And I thought about where I was now. I was a billionaire. I was running an accelerator that was helping hundreds of founders. I was building something that mattered. I was happy. But more than that, I had learned something that no amount of money could buy. I had learned that revenge doesn't actually satisfy you. That anger doesn't actually make you feel better. That trying to prove something to someone else is a hollow victory. What actually satisfies you is building something you love. What actually makes you feel better is moving forward instead of looking backward. What actually matters is becoming the person you want to be, not proving that someone else made a mistake. 2 years later, I got a message from David Chen. He had sold his consulting business and had joined Rising as a venture partner. He was investing in startups. He was helping founders. He was doing good work. We had worked together for 2 years at that point without really addressing what had happened between us all those years ago. One day we were sitting in the office late, and I brought it up. I said, David, do you ever think about what happened at Zenith? Do you ever think about what you did? He said, every day. For 6 years, I thought about it every day. I couldn't escape it. It was with me all the time. And then I realized that I could either let it destroy me or I could learn from it. I said, and what did you learn? He said, I learned that shortcuts don't actually work. I learned that taking credit for other people's work might feel good for 5 minutes, but then it haunts you forever. I learned that integrity matters more than advancement. I learned all of that too late, but at least I learned it. He said, and I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that what you built, not just velocity, but rising, the impact you're having, I'm proud of you. Genuinely proud. And I know I don't deserve to say that, but I'm saying it anyway. I said, thank you. And I want to tell you that I've let go of the anger. I've let go of the hurt. I've let go of needing you to suffer for what you did. I've just let it go. He nodded. He said, I'm glad. Because you deserve to be free from that. I said, we both do. About 8 months after that conversation, I got a call from a reporter. She said she was writing a profile about me for a major business publication. She wanted to do a deep dive into my journey. From zenith to velocity to rising. I agreed to do it. During the interview, she asked me the obvious question. She asked me about Richard. About what it felt like to see my former boss's company fail while I was succeeding. I thought about how to answer that. I said, I'll be honest. When I first started Velocity, a lot of my motivation was proving that I was right and Richard was wrong. That was fuel. That was what kept me going on the hard days. She said, and now? I said, now? I don't think about Richard very often. And when I do, I think about him with compassion. Because I realized that he was trapped in his own way of thinking. He was trapped by his ego. He was trapped by his need to be right. And that's a prison that a lot of people build for themselves without even realizing it. She said, so you forgive him? I said, I've let it go. Whether or not I've forgiven him is less important than the fact that I'm no longer angry at him. I no longer need him to suffer to feel like I've succeeded. I no longer need his failure to validate my success. And that's freedom. That's what really matters. The profile came out 3 weeks later. It was long. It was detailed. It told the entire story. And when it came out, something unexpected happened. I started getting contacted by other founders. Other people who had experienced betrayal. Other people who had been treated unfairly in their careers. Other people who had built companies out of anger and were now realizing, like I had, that anger wasn't sustainable. These founders were reaching out asking for advice. Asking how I had moved beyond it. Asking how I had transformed pain into purpose without letting the pain consume me. And I realized that my story wasn't just my story. It was a template. It was a framework for what was possible when you took something traumatic and turned it into something meaningful. So I decided to write a book. I didn't want to write a revenge fantasy where I crushed my enemies. I didn't want to write a story where I proved everyone wrong and lived happily ever after. I wanted to write a book about the real journey. About the pain. About the anger. About learning to let it go. About building something that mattered. About using your trauma as fuel instead of letting it burn you up from the inside. It took me 2 years to write. I wrote about every detail. Every conversation with Richard. Every moment of doubt. Every victory that felt hollow until I realized I was building for the wrong reasons. Every moment of growth when I started building for the right reasons. When the book came out, it became a bestseller. Not because of the revenge fantasy, there was no revenge fantasy in the book. But because of the honesty. Because of the vulnerability. Because people could see themselves in my story. And then something happened that I never expected. Richard reached out. He said he wanted to endorse the book. He said he wanted to write a foreword. I was hesitant. I said, Richard, are you sure? Endorsing this book means people will know that you're the person I'm writing about. It means you're confirming that everything I said about how you treated me is true. He said, I know. And I want to do it anyway. Because it's true. And because I think people need to hear from me that this is real. That I made these mistakes. That I'm sorry. And that it's possible to learn and grow and change even after you've done something deeply wrong. So Richard wrote a foreword. In it, he talked about his leadership failures. He talked about how he had dismissed Emma of me and how that dismissal had cost him more than just an employee. He talked about how his need to be right had limited his ability to see what was right. And he wrote, if you're reading this book, you're reading the story of someone who was brave enough to leave something comfortable to build something uncertain. And I was foolish enough to think that was weakness. I was foolish enough to think that ambition was something to fear instead of something to nurture. This book is a reminder that we all have the capacity to be wrong. The question is whether we have the courage to admit it and actually change. The book became even bigger after that. Because now it wasn't just my story. It was the story of two people who had both experienced failure and had both chosen to learn from it. Richard's consulting company grew. My accelerator grew. Rising became one of the most successful venture accelerators in the country. We were funding companies that were worth billions. We were creating thousands of jobs. We were changing industries. And the reason it worked wasn't because I had crushed my enemies or proved everyone wrong or any of that. It worked because I had built something real. Something authentic. Something that actually mattered. 10 years after I left Zenith, I was giving a talk at a business conference. It was a big stage. Thousands of people in the audience. I was talking about entrepreneurship. About building companies. About learning from failure. During the Q&A, a young woman stood up. She said, I read your book. I listened to your story. And I want to know something. Do you have any regrets? Is there anything you wish you had done differently? I thought about the question. I said, honestly, if I could go back in time, I would tell myself something different. I would tell myself that the success wasn't about proving something to Richard. The success was about discovering something about myself. I said, when I was building Velocity, I was so focused on winning that I almost missed the fact that I actually loved building things. I almost missed the fact that I loved solving problems. I almost missed the fact that I loved leading a team toward something impossible. I said, if I could change one thing, I would change the timeline. Instead of spending 6 years angry and then figuring it out, I wish I had figured it out faster. I wish I had realized sooner that the only person I needed to prove something to was myself. I said, but looking back, I wouldn't change the journey. Because the journey is what made me who I am. The pain is what taught me. The anger was fuel, and I learned how to use it without letting it burn me up. After the talk, I was walking out, and I ran into someone unexpected. It was my old boss from before Richard. It was Marcus's boss. It was someone I hadn't thought about in years. She said, Emma, I've been following your journey. I've been reading about you. And I just want to say I'm sorry. I said, for what? She said, for not seeing you when you were working for me. For not pushing you harder. For not fighting for you when you needed someone to fight for you. I read your book, and I realized I could have been that person. And I wasn't. I said, that was a long time ago. She said, I know. But I want you to know that I see you now. And I'm proud of you. I'm proud of what you built. I hugged her. And I meant it. I was grateful for her words. But I also didn't need them. I didn't need her validation or her apology to feel like I had succeeded. That was the biggest shift. The biggest change from 10 years earlier. Back then, I needed everyone to acknowledge my success. I needed Richard to admit he was wrong. I needed David to suffer. I needed the world to recognize that I had been right all along. Now, I didn't need any of that. Now I just needed to know that I had built something real. That I had helped people. That I had made a difference. 12 years after I left Zenith, I was on the cover of a business magazine. The headline was The Billionaire Who Turned Betrayal into an Empire. I looked at that cover and I almost didn't recognize myself. Because the person in that photo wasn't the person I felt like on the inside. The person in that photo looked like she had all the answers. The person inside felt like she was constantly learning, constantly growing, constantly figuring it out as she went. But I guess that's the disconnect between what the world sees and what we experience internally. What the world saw was success. What I experienced was a journey. Around that time, I got a call from someone I never expected to hear from. It was James, my original engineer. The person who took a risk and joined me when velocity was nothing but an idea. He said, "Emma, I need to tell you something. I'm starting my own company. And I want you to know, it's time. It's time for me to do my own thing." I said, "That's amazing. I'm so proud of you." He said, "I wouldn't be able to do this without you. You were the first person to believe in me. You were the first person who made me feel like my ideas mattered. When I was at Zenith, I was just writing code that I didn't believe in. But with you, I believed in what we were building." I said, "You're going to do great things. You're going to build something incredible." And he did. His company became one of the most successful startups in the industry. And through Rising, we invested in him. We became his venture partner. We helped him scale. That's what Rising became. It became a community of people who had been hurt, who had learned from their hurt, and who were now helping other people do the same thing. By year 15, Rising had invested in over 500 companies. Over 100 of those companies had succeeded in massive ways. We had helped create over 50,000 jobs. We had returned billions of dollars to our investors. But more than that, we had created a culture. A community of founders who understood that success wasn't about crushing your enemies or proving something to someone else. Success was about building something that mattered. Success was about impact. Success was about legacy. One day, I was going through some old files, and I found something. It was my original business plan for Velocity. The plan I had written the night after Richard fired me. The plan that was soaked in anger and revenge and the need to prove something. I read through it, and I was shocked by how much of it was still there. The core idea was still there. The market analysis was still there. The vision was still there. But the motivation had changed completely. Back then, I was building to destroy. Now, I was building to create. Back then, I was building against Richard. Now, I was building for myself and for the people I wanted to serve. It was the same company. The same vision. But it came from a completely different place. I realized that this was the real victory. Not the money. Not the success. But the transformation. The fact that I had taken something that started as poison and turned it into medicine. 20 years after I left Zenith, there was a moment that brought everything full circle. I was at a charity event. It was a gala for an organization that helps young entrepreneurs. I had been supporting them for years. And I ran into Richard again. He was older now. We both were. But he looked good. He looked happy. He looked at peace. We sat down and talked for an hour. We talked about everything. About Zenith. About Velocity. About Rising. About the book. About the journey. And at the end of the conversation, I said, "Richard, can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." I said, "Do you think you would have treated me differently if you had known? If you had known that I would go on to build something bigger than Zenith? If you had known that your company would fail and mine would succeed? Do you think you would have handled it differently?" He was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Honestly, I don't know. I'd like to think I would have. I'd like to think that knowing the future would have made me different. But I suspect I would have been the same. Because I was who I was at that moment. And I didn't know any better." He said, "But that's the thing about time. It changes you. It teaches you. And if you're lucky, if you're willing to actually learn, it transforms you into someone better." He said, "I'm a different person now than I was 20 years ago. Not because I knew what the future held. But because I lived through it. Because I experienced the consequences of my choices. Because I was willing to actually change." I said, "I'm glad we got to have this conversation." He said, "So am I." We hugged. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't forced. It just was what it was. Two people who had hurt each other, who had both moved on, who had both learned and grown. That night, I went home and I didn't sleep for a while. I just sat and thought about the entire journey. I thought about the pain. I thought about the anger. I thought about the revenge fantasy that had consumed so much of my energy. And I thought about how I had let it go. And I realized something. I realized that the real victory wasn't beating Richard. The real victory was becoming the person I wanted to be despite what he had done to me. The real victory was taking something that was meant to destroy me and turning it into something that created. The real victory was forgiveness. Not for Richard's sake, but for my own sake. By year 25, I was still running Rising. The accelerator had become legendary in the startup world. We had a hit rate that was unprecedented. We had helped create multiple billion-dollar companies. And Zenith Solutions? It had faded into obscurity. There was a Wikipedia page about it, but no one really cared anymore. It was a relic of a different era. Project Nexus was completely forgotten. No one talked about it. No one remembered it. And I realized that that was the real ending to this story. It wasn't that I had crushed Zenith. It wasn't that I had proven Richard wrong. It was that Zenith became irrelevant. It was that I had moved so far beyond it, had accomplished so much that had nothing to do with it, that what had seemed so important 25 years ago was now just a footnote in a much larger story. That's real victory. Not destruction. Not revenge. But transcendence. But here's the thing. Here's the final twist that I never expected. I got a call from a journalist. She said she was writing a book about Rise accelerators and the founders they had funded. She wanted to interview me. During the interview, she asked me about failure. She asked me about moments when I had wanted to give up. I told her stories. Stories about the early days of Velocity when we almost ran out of money. Stories about pivots that didn't work. Stories about investor meetings that went south. And then she asked me something that caught me off guard. She said, "Do you feel like you learned more from your success at Velocity or from your failure at Zenith?" I said, "That's a great question. Because honestly, I didn't learn much from my success. Success just validated what I already believed about myself. But failure? Failure taught me everything." I said, "Getting fired from Zenith taught me that I was resilient. It taught me that I could start over. It taught me that my worth wasn't tied to my job title or my boss's opinion of me. It taught me that I was capable of more than I thought I was." I said, "And honestly, if I had never been fired, I might have spent my entire career building someone else's company. I might have stayed comfortable. I might have never discovered what I was actually capable of." And then I said something that surprised even me. I said, "I'm grateful for what Richard did. Not because it was right or fair or kind, but because it forced me to become myself. It forced me to stop seeking external validation and start seeking internal truth. It forced me to discover that I had been settling, that I had been small, that I was capable of so much more than I was allowing myself to be." The journalist looked shocked. She said, "You're grateful that your boss fired you?" I said, "I'm grateful for what it led to. I'm grateful that it forced me to grow. I'm grateful that it pushed me out of my comfort zone. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us are actually gifts. They're just wrapped in pain and we don't recognize them as gifts until much later." That interview came out and it went viral. It was shared thousands of times. People resonated with the message. And I started getting letters. Letters from people who had experienced betrayal. People who had been fired. People who had felt like the world had wronged them. And they were telling me that my story had given them hope. My story had shown them that it was possible to take something terrible and turn it into something beautiful. That's when I realized something. The real victory wasn't mine alone. The real victory was shared. Because my journey had become a template for other people's journeys. My transformation had given other people permission to transform. My pain had become their inspiration. 30 years after I left Zenith, I was sitting in my office, and I decided to go back and visit the place. The building was still there. The 52nd floor was still there. But Zenith was gone. I walked through the empty floor and I remembered everything. I remembered standing at that window looking out at the city. I remembered feeling like I had made it. I remembered the conference room where my work had been stolen. And I felt nothing. Not anger. Not sadness. Not even satisfaction. Just peace. Because that person I was 30 years ago, she didn't exist anymore. The Emma who was obsessed with proving something, who was consumed by revenge, who thought that destroying her enemy would make her happy, that Emma was gone. I had become someone different. Someone better. Someone who understood that the real victory is always about growth. Always about transformation. Always about becoming. I walked out of that building and I went back to my company. Rising was still growing. We were still investing in founders. We were still changing the world. And I realized that this was my real victory. Not the destruction of Zenith. Not the humiliation of Richard. Not proving that I was right and everyone else was wrong. My real victory was this. This company that was helping other people build their dreams. This community that was supporting each other. This legacy that would outlast me. This was what I had built when I stopped building against someone and started building for something. And that, in the end, is the real moral of the story. The real victory isn't about crushing your enemies. It's about creating something better than what they created. It's about becoming someone better than what they are. It's about moving so far beyond the pain that it becomes irrelevant. It's about letting go of revenge and embracing purpose. It's about understanding that the person who hurt you doesn't deserve to take up space in your mind anymore. They don't deserve to define your journey. You do. Your vision defines your journey. Your purpose defines your journey. Your choices define your journey. And when you realize that, when you actually internalize that, that's when you're free. That's when you can finally move forward. And that's the real ending to this story. Not me defeating my enemy, but me defeating myself. The version of myself that was stuck in the past. The version of myself that was defined by anger. The version of myself that thought external victory could provide internal peace. That version of myself had to die. And from her ashes, something new was born. That's what this 30-year journey has been about. And looking back, I wouldn't change a second of it. Not the pain. Not the betrayal. Not the anger. Not even the revenge fantasy that consumed me for years. Because all of it was necessary. All of it was part of the transformation. And I'm grateful for all of it. Because I'm not just a billionaire. I'm not just someone who built successful companies. I'm not just someone who proved everyone wrong. I'm someone who learned how to turn pain into purpose. Someone who learned how to let go. Someone who learned how to forgive. Someone who learned how to build something real instead of building against something false. And that, in the end, is the greatest victory of all. Thank you for listening to my story.